As a young man embarking upon a career in farming, George Washington followed the course of most Virginians. He grew field upon field of tobacco. But Washington was unhappy with the unstable price of tobacco, and he learned the hard way that tobacco exhausted the nutrients in the soil. So like an adventurous scientist in a laboratory, Washington moved in a different direction. He created his own 7-year crop rotation plan, used a wide variety of natural fertilizers, and established wheat as his most important crop.
Yet separating the grain from the straw was a messy and wasteful business. Horses treaded the wheat outdoors, where wind could blow it in all directions, and rain could virtually ruin the wheat before it had a chance to be delivered to Washington's grist mill. It's not surprising that a man like Washington, so accustomed to playing a leadership role on the battlefield and in politics, would not sit back and accept the status quo. Instead, he was determined to invent a new way to tread wheat. The secret to his success was a different type of barn, a unique, machine-like structure that Washington designed to revolutionize the processing of wheat.
George Washington just loved farming. And I think that building this barn was probably one of the most exciting things he did in his entire life. And I think he'd be very, very proud that we've just spent, my gosh, 5 years and almost $2 million building this barn exactly the way he built it 200 years ago.
Washington's barn is a complex 2-story structure, 52 feet in diameter and over 40 feet tall. It was built into an earthen embankment so that horses could travel up a ramp to the second floor. The barn has 16 sides. It's almost round, so that the horses could move in a continuous circle, treading the wheat every single step along the way. The treading out process successfully separated the grain from the straw, and because the kernels of grain were smaller, they fell through carefully measured gaps in the floorboards to the lower level of the barn.
Here, slaves used shovels to scoop up the grain. It was then cleaned through a process called winnowing, packaged into sacks and barrels, and transported by wagon to Washington's mill. The straw was then added to the dung yard to make compost for the fields.
Because Washington believed his new barn should be able to process grain faster than ever before, and with a minimum of waste, he designed 4 other structures to work in tandem with the barn. 2 stables housed the horses and mules that were used to tread the wheat and to pull wagons stacked with wheat from the fields. Corn, perhaps Washington's second most important crop, was stored and dried in 2 corn houses. The slatted siding provided good air ventilation. The corn was used to feed the hard-working labor force and livestock.
Well, it's really quite amazing how creatively and carefully Washington designed the whole complex. It's more than just a group of buildings. It's really an innovative working machine, and it's the kind of creative thinking that stoked the Industrial Revolution a century later.
Breaking new ground is never as easy as it first appears. Washington had hoped that his slave craftsmen could finish building the barn in a matter of months, but it ended up taking almost 2 years. He faced many of the same problems builders face today. Quality materials were hard to come by, and bad weather often held up construction. In addition, his craftsmen were sometimes needed as extra hands in the fields at harvest time.
In 1794, the meticulous Washington wrote his overseer about the proper measurement of the gaps between the floorboards. The carpenters were ordered to lay down the floor using 1-inch gaps, then experiment at 1.5 inches. Section after section, Washington wrote, until you hit the mark exactly.
I don't think anything slipped by George Washington. In fact, I think he would have been a very difficult man to work for in the 18th century. Even though he was fair and reasonable, he was such a stickler for detail. In fact, I think today we would classify him as a certified workaholic.
Washington himself calculated that more than 30,000 bricks would be required for the barn's foundation and the first floor walls. but he ordered that 40,000 bricks be fired to allow for extensive breakage. The bricks were made from clay dug from the construction site. The clay was hand-formed in wooden molds, dried in the brickyard, and then finally fired in a kiln at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To create the first floor of Washington's barn, experienced masons carefully laid some 30,000 bricks, one at a time. Laborers hand-mixed the mortar, using a recipe prescribed by Washington himself, and then transported it to the site in a hod. The bricks were stacked together for easy access, and using a trowel, an experienced bricklayer could set them in place in fast succession.
But the 16 sides Washington called for did present some problems. Many of the bricks needed to be chiseled down in size to make them fit together perfectly. After all, who knew when Washington, with his discerning eye for detail, would appear around the corner for a surprise inspection?
Long before the bricks were laid, Washington's workers would have scoured the nearby forests for the oldest and straightest oak and pine trees. After the bark is stripped away and the sides of the log are hand-hewed, each huge piece of wood was rolled onto a pit saw where two-man teams used gravity to saw edges that are remarkably square. Washington's best carpenters then measured and cut the joints that would link these timbers together.
By using interlocking joints as much as possible, it makes for a more simple structure, easier to build. Less nails are needed in the structure if the mortises and tenons fit properly.
And that's important because iron nails were hard to come by and could be expensive. So the fewer nails required, the better. The moment came when almost every available hand was needed to pull the barn together.
The post being raised for the inner octagon is almost 20 feet long. It probably weighs somewhere between 700 and 800 pounds. We've rigged a block and tackle to help raise it here that increases the mechanical advantage for the people pulling from the ground, and there are also some people up on a scaffold helping to pull up and make sure the thing doesn't tip one way or the other.
In just a matter of minutes, the posts are raised, and the wood frame for the barn's second story soon rises tall. Washington, the architect, could begin to see whether his design was a winner, or if it's back to the drawing board. Once the 8 support posts were set, they were connected by a ring of plates that fit together and overlapped each of the posts. To provide added strength, because 2 horses together could weigh as much as a ton, carpenters placed a series of braces on the top and bottom. At long last, the rafters were fit into place to support the roof, and hand-ribbed cypress shingles were carefully overlapped to shelter the treading process. Cypress naturally sheds rainwater, and if the shingles are properly applied, they could last for as long as 75 years.
Washington was 62 years old by the time the barn was finished. But when it came to farming, he acted like a young man. He was always curious and experimenting. Now, whether or not the barn lived up to Washington's high expectations, we really don't know, and I somehow doubt that it did. Washington was a stern taskmaster when it came to others, but he demanded even more from himself.
Today, Washington's barn stands tall and strong, beckoning visitors to step in and experience for themselves the results of his unique approach to farming, leaving no doubt that George Washington was indeed a pioneer farmer.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.